Welcome to this month's Aware webinar. I'm going to give you all just a few moments to come in, and then we'll get started. It's great. There's 120 people in already. So we'll just wait another few moments. Okay, my name is Claire Hayes, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this month's Aware webinar, Building Resilience in Our Children and Young People. Some of you at this stage are very familiar with Aware, but for those of you who aren't, Aware is Ireland's national organisation to support people with depression, anxiety and bipolar disorder. We have a range of services that are free to the general public, information, psychoeducation, and we also have services to support people who are concerned about other people. So I encourage you to check out the website, and this month's webinar, as the others, is being recorded. There's a key thing about questions. We have some really good questions in advance. Today I'm going to be in conversation with Dr. Colman Noctor, child and adolescent psychotherapist, psychoanalytical psychotherapist. I'm really looking forward to it. And my role in this webinar is a little bit different from some of the others because helping children build resilience is an absolute passion of mine and something that I spend a lot of time doing. So supporting parents to do it. So I'll be working with Colman, conversation around it, and looking forward to it. So we've got some key questions in already. I'd invite you to relax if you can. And my sense is that some of you might really have specific questions you want addressed. So if you could give us a little chance to see if we're going to answer them anyway, because I'm sure, Colman, you have a good sense of what questions parents are concerned about, and I have as well. And we cover the questions that have come in as well. But if maybe halfway through you have a sense of, no, you're not addressing my question, please then submit it. I'm saying that knowing I won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll absolutely do our best. So that's setting anxiety for myself and you, Colman. So Colman, if I can very much welcome you to this webinar. Thank you so much for giving your time. And I'd like to, rather than me giving an introduction, if you'd introduce yourself and also a little bit about why you're interested in this topic in the first place.
Thanks, Claire. And listen, it's always a pleasure to be involved in anything that Aware is running. It's been a few years since I've done something with you guys, and it's always a very well organized, and the hospitality is always fantastic. So thank you for that. But yeah, I'm working in child and adolescent mental health services now for 25 years. It was a specialty. I began my career as a mental health nurse, and my first placement was in a child and adolescent unit. And I've kind of never worked with grown-ups since then. Really, it's kind of been sticking with young people and families all the way through. Worked over the UK, Ireland, in various different settings. But the area of, I suppose we see things changing there's a lot of things are the same. I mean, the presentations of young people with anxiety, self-harm, mood problems, that's fairly constant. But the landscape in which children are trying to negotiate has been vastly different. We've seen the advent of technology. We've had, I think, increased pressure, expectations. We've seen academic performance become more focused. And so I think the world that children are negotiating and coming through has changed considerably. And that's always something that I've loved, actually. I really enjoy working with young people. They say working with young people keeps you young in some respects, but it does. It keeps you on point. And although many of my patients and clients and people who I work with probably think I'm a dinosaur in many respects, I try very hard to try and keep up with the contemporary side of things. And it's just an ever-evolving dynamic. And COVID-19 in the last 2 years has brought a whole new raft of challenges to the area, which, as much as it's difficult, it is a really intriguing and interesting time to be working in children's mental health because of the changing dynamics and the ever different challenges that are coming through. But I'm very lucky, and I say this very seriously. I mean, if you love what you do, you don't work a day in your life. And I would still be as passionate about working with young people as I did when I started in 1996 or whatever it was. So I'm very, very lucky. I love it. It's an area I've dedicated much of my life to. And I'm also a parent. I have three small children myself now. I have a 10-year-old, a 11-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 6-year-old. So, watching them navigate this with, I suppose, the knowledge of where I've seen other people struggle and all of those different things, it's yeah, it's different. It's difficult. And people say, "Oh, you're the child psychotherapist. Your children are going to be perfect," and you're kind of going, "Geez, the pressure of that." And but yeah, look, it's a fascinating area. It's something I've always loved, and I fell into it, but kind of knew I was home once I got to it, and I've always felt a part of it and never had any desire to do anything different ever since.
Okay, brilliant. And we were just talking before the webinar that the lecture that you get for Aware, which is on video and is on the Aware website, has continued to be hugely popular. So just to let people know that that's there. There's one I gave as well on understanding and managing anxiety, and there's loads of others that are there. So just in case I forget to say that. So if I can just give you a little bit of background, because I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Colman, and we're coming at it from two different angles, if you like, because you're working in the mental health area and that's where you started. I started in the education field. I qualified as a primary school teacher, so 10 years earlier than you. So I'm still the same age. Of course I'm not, but feel it and younger. But so I'm looking at 35 years ago, 1986, I qualified. And I loved teaching, didn't want to do anything else. But as I began to teach, I realized that children were very anxious for different reasons. So they were worried that they might not have got 10 out of 10. They were worried about them not being popular in class or being left out or letting their parents down or whatever. And I really realized that there's a pattern for children who experience anxiety that I have seen. And certainly from right back in 1986, I was seeing it at that stage. They're perfectionist. They don't like making a mistake. They're usually the good kids. They minimize what they do well. They worry about what they think they won't do well. Sometimes when they're little, the dad can be away. And as they get older, they can get quite controlling because they want things to be a certain way. So, because then they feel better. So what I found was the more I reassured them, the more I told them, you're fine, you're grand, don't worry, it didn't work. It backfired. So I went to UCD in 1988 to do psychology, to be a better teacher. And then I came across cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And I remember really well my reaction that that's common sense. Everyone knows that. And then I realized, well, it is common sense, but people didn't know it, don't use it. I knew it, but I wasn't using it maybe. And then as a teacher, I thought, why don't we teach this? Why don't people learn this? Why do we teach other things in school and we don't teach the basics of how we feel, what we think, what we believe, what we do? So over the last 35 years, that's my area of passion. And the longer I do it, the more I realize that my interest in anxiety actually goes way back to when I was a child and feeling very anxious at different times. And interestingly, and I'm saying this publicly for the first time, I don't have children. And that would have been the cross, as somebody described it to me in my life, about really, really wanting to be. I always saw myself as being a mother, always. So the study stuff right through my 20s was a hobby until I met the guy and had the children, and then lived happily ever after. But interestingly, my journey in that and my working with parents and children and parents who've had miscarriages or stillbirths or adults who haven't had children, I found that my experience in not being a mother has actually helped me massively in my work. So I want to put that out there because I've never said it before, but I think the anxiety I've always felt is in talking to parents about their children. It's, well, what do you know because you don't have children? Of course, I have 4 amazing godchildren, 2 almost godchildren. They're different reasons, unofficially godchildren, and loads of nieces and nephews. But it's interesting though, and the sense of even recently commenting to parents jokingly, and then thinking, they looked at me, oh, you're the psychologist. I think, oh, I was only having fun. I was only joking. So it's an interesting hat. So that's anyway my where I'm coming from, Colman, with this. So if I can go back to COVID, and actually if I can go a little bit further back, because we were talking about technology, and pre-COVID, a lot of the anxiety parents were expressing to me was around the social media, around children being excluded, around bullying on social media. and the pressure around that. So my sense is that's still there. But if you could talk about what you've noticed in terms of the pressures that children and parents have had over the last number of years.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was listening to you speak there about, seeing the anxiety in children in the 80s and 90s, and anxiety is one of those things that it's time immemorial. It's always been there. But from the point of view of the world in which we have to navigate has evolved and changed. And the big kind of debate is that, people say, oh, children are soft now and they're not tough enough and they don't have, resilience again, I suppose for me, the issue is I think the world has gotten a lot more complex. And so what they're being asked to manage is more difficult. And I would say around the era of technology, we see a lot of the conversations around technology, around cyberbullying, around exposure to pornography, around social media pressures, etc. For me, the influence of technology is much more subtle than that. I think it's something about I think it was Winston Churchill said, we design buildings and then the building designs us. And I always use the example of, going to pay for something pre-COVID, and I went to tap my card, and the girl in the Circle K station said, "Oh, the tap isn't working." And then she started to apologize. So my face must have said, "What, you mean I have to press 4 buttons?" And it was like this nonsense thing. And I was kind of saying, I pressed 4 buttons 6 months ago. It's absolutely no problem. Why is it a problem now? And it's maybe that the easier things become, the harder things appear. From the point of view of technology is very much about speed, convenience, shortcuts. You don't have to waste, no boredom, no distress, no, Wi-Fi speed so quick that you won't have to think about it. And if we place that expectation on our lives that everything is going to be fast, quick, filled, we become a very gratification focused society, and we lose out on what I believe is a core concept, which is fulfillment, which is much more different and is not part of the technology narrative. So when children are told about, you can be anything you want to be and you can do this and that's not necessarily reassuring. That's oftentimes pressure. Do you know what I mean? And I always go back to my old algorithm of, expectation minus reality equals happiness. And I think compared to where we were in the 80s and 90s, our expectations are different. Our expectations of what it is, how much is enough, is different. And so children are exposed to this tyranny of choice, this tyranny of options, this tyranny of limitlessness, and even in our narrative around all you can eat data, unlimited, it's all very, it celebrates excess, from the point of view of that there's never enough. And I do have an issue around how do we as a society determine how much is enough? And I think how do we determine that for children? And that perfectionism that you talked about, where children are upset when they get 9 out of 10 because where did I lose the one? And the idea of that our world can be perfect. And we live in a world which is very focused on editing. It's photoshopped, it's cut, it's edited, it's pasted, and it's a very outward focused platform. The technology is about and I would describe this as kind of the Tinderization of society. So you put your best picture, your most witty one line, your most interesting hobbies, and it's all outward facing. So we place a huge emphasis on performance and what it is that people see. And we place a lot less emphasis on the behind the scenes piece, because the profile is what will get you swiped left or right. So we invest heavily in that. And I think that's a message that children and young people pick up, and they get so consumed by performance. And one of the things I would have heard more so than ever before would have been, Colman, I spent my whole life being who other people wanted me to be, and I forgot to be myself. And I think that's a hugely influential narrative, if that's what children and young people are growing up with, this notion of performance, this notion of expectation, this notion of perfection. There is no enough, and without enoughness there is no contentment, and without contentment then is there ever a point at which we can be settled? And so I think the thin end of the wedge is the cyberbullying stuff and the social media kind of the incidents within the technology thing. But I think the technology narrative is problematic, because children, and it's interesting to point out, is that the iPhone baby isn't even 12 yet. So the real influence of this, we haven't really seen it yet. They haven't even hit teenage years yet. And so the impact on how does technology impact us, it's everywhere, it's pervasive, and people that say, when should you introduce your child to technology? As soon as you have a kind of a baby intercom in the baby's cot, that's technology. Do you know what I mean? It's not just social media and Snapchat and Facebook and things like that. It's the whole gamut of technology, which has a very different narrative than the emotional one. And maybe it's causing us to miss steps. Maybe it's causing us to focus on the wrong things, and maybe it's measuring us in a way that we've never been measured before.
That makes so much sense. And I love how you're setting the conversation in a sociological context, that it's not just about the individual, it's the society that we live in and the developments. And my understanding of anxiety is it's a basic primitive instinct that our ancestors had thousands and thousands of years ago to keep them safe. So if they saw the bear, they either decided that they were going to be able to fight the bear, so they got lots of adrenaline to fight, or they decided, this guy's too big, I need to go. And he ran really fast, or she ran really fast. So again, lots of adrenaline. And now our bodies are still experiencing the, I was going to say symptoms, the manifestations of anxiety. So the sick feeling in our stomach, clammy hands, sweaty, heart's racing, lots of thoughts. But that fight flight mechanism can be switched on by danger and or what we think is danger, perceived danger. So we're at a point now, we're in the middle of August, well, close to the middle of August, and parents are looking ahead. So they're looking at their children starting school. They're children moving into secondary school, kind of key transitions. There are parents watching this who might be concerned that they've had COVID. What are the implications going to be for long term, or for their children or their teenagers? And then they hold peace around socialization. They've been away from their friends. Children going into secondary school who maybe are going into exam years. Are they going to sit exams? What will that be like? They've missed people going in to do their junior cert, first year, second year, completely changed due to COVID. So there are anxieties that parents are probably experiencing, and young people. And they might be noticing that they feel in the tummy, or not wanting to go out. So they're safer when they're at home. And my understanding of anxiety is that if I'm in the car and I think, did I lock the front door, I'll check so I feel better. But if I keep checking, then I could be feeding into the anxiety, heading down the road of obsessive compulsive disorder even. So for me to stop checking makes me feel worse. So when I'm working with parents around the whole area of anxiety, I'm keen to explain to them that it's paradox. It's a bit like the treatment for cancer. Chemotherapy, we know, does not make people feel better initially. It makes them feel worse. So in facing our fears with anxiety, taking our power back, it's great if we feel bad. It's great if we feel the sick feeling in our tummy, rather than, oh my gosh, there's something wrong, because that means that we're actually doing something to challenge it. So I'm just thinking, Colman, if I go down through some of the questions we've got in, and I'd just like you to address one. There's a question here. Sorry, before we do that, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, no, I think my own idea on anxiety, if I'm trying to make it simple, is the fear of the unknown. And when we don't know the outcome, it makes us anxious. And so every transition, albeit to secondary school, to start school, to do something, is an unknown. So we're entering into the unknown. And the last 18 months have been the most collective unknown period that we've looked to everyone for answers, and we haven't had one. So children look to parents, parents look to government look to the EU, we look to the World Health Organization, and there hasn't been answers. And so we've had to mull our way through this massive unknown, which creates more anxiety. And as you say, we tend to try and manage it by controlling the controllables. So last March, we all ran out to Aldi and got bales of toilet roll for some reason to make us feel better. And, because the downstairs toilet had 6 bales of toilet roll, it made us feel better for an hour or two. But then we were back to being anxious again. And so, either over controlling the controllable variable, which is, I'm just stay inside. It's just easier rather than going outside and facing it. And again, the more we kick down the road the transition, the more anxious the transition becomes, in terms of getting out there, changing and all that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, the fear of the unknown, until we have a better sense of knowing what is next. And we don't. We've come a long way with vaccines and everything else, but there's still a considerable air of mystery to where we're at the moment. And that means collectively we'll all feel that bit more anxious. And it's interesting because people described feeling anxious who'd never felt anxious before. People were experiencing this kind of, new challenge of trying to overcome life and the nothingness of lockdowns and pandemics and everything else, who ostensibly would have never had that experience before. And so we're seeing a lot more people entering into the mental distress kind of cohort than ever before. And yeah, it's a real challenge. And that's why, and is there an anxiety pandemic as well? There probably is, and it runs in parallel to the physiological one. But yeah, and that's reflected in the level of referrals and concern. And I've never witnessed anything like the demand for services and support that I have in the last year and a half, and more so probably in the last 6 months, really since Christmas. I think the fatigue of the third lockdown really has had its, and again, that's another element of why we get anxious, and why the longer we have to stay in a distressed moment, the harder it becomes to endure, and so the length of time of these experiences is crucially important to whether they become a bigger issue or not.
And when you think about it, Colman, in the last year and a half, we've been telling children to keep safe, that the world isn't safe. So to keep safe, to keep your distance, to keep safe, wash your hands an awful lot, keep safe, don't touch certain things. So I don't think it's surprising at all that children, teenagers, and adults have developed safety mechanisms that now can backfire. So how many times do you have to wash your hands before you feel better? How far do you stay back from everybody? So avoidance was understandable, but moving forward, it's not going to be helpful. So changing that pattern is going to be difficult, or can be difficult. So just like a quote I came across years ago, I really like: ships in harbor are safe, but that's not what they're built for. So I think over COVID period, we kind of felt safe. Certainly I felt safe at home. And I remember you're talking about the petrol station. I remember the first time going out feeling really, really anxious. And, I was wearing my mask, other people weren't. What do we do? And then as I got used to it, then my feeling of anxiety went. It's a bit like a bar of soap. If we don't use a bar of soap, it stays a bar of soap. If we don't face our anxiety, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But every single time we face it, every time we do something that, even though we're feeling anxious, it's like using the bar of soap, and then gradually it gets smaller. We've got a few questions in, and actually we've got the pre ones, but we've got a really nice comment. Any pointers or ideas in balancing affirming children's concerns with them needing to be realistic? And the old wisdom of the sooner we realize life is not easy, the better life gets. It's a bit like the Buddhist view. I think life is about suffering. So that I think is very much, an analytic perspective as well. So before I go down through the questions, have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it's Freud famously said, the most we can hope for is the misery of everyday life, and I'm not so sure that's a very not a very Instagrammable phrase, but I think from the point of view of it is about your ability to focus on what is important. The important stuff is still important: family, health, connection, relationships. They haven't gotten less important. What is the issue is that we're starting to overvalue the small stuff. And that's where, I suppose the role of technology and that social narrative of this is the real important stuff. And can I answer that in a way that might just help other people? I mean, there's a metaphor around this guy comes into a classroom, and he fills a jar full of rocks, and he asks the class if it's full, and they said yes. And then he puts pebbles in between the rocks, and he says, now is it full? And they said yes. And then he put sand in there, and he says, now is it full? And they said yes. And he said, that represents a fulfilled and meaningful life. The rocks are the really important things. The pebbles are the semi-important things, and the sand is the cosmetic rubbish that's not really that important at all. In life, we are now being sold the idea that sand is really important. So if we fill our lives up with sand, we've no room for rocks and pebbles. So for me, teaching your child what is a rock, what is their pebble, and what is their sand will allow them to prioritize it in a
Yes.
way that they keep the important stuff important and don't sweat the small stuff. And again, so rather than trying to kind of teach everything in it that's an excessive, that's not enough, it's really about them being aware of the fulfilling, meaningful priorities within their lives, as opposed to, and that's a counter narrative. That's a narrative where home has to be the place where we set the values and the beliefs and the important stuff. And that's not to be set by an algorithm on a social media site, or what Instagram tells us is important. It's about maintaining our own sense of agency. So at home, in short, it's about value systems. It's about teaching your children to identify and prioritize what's important, because that in turn will allow them to not sweat the small stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And in terms of resilience, we're talking about young people, and we're talking about the 80s, but the parents who have the young people now are people who grew up in the 80s and the 90s. Some of them are younger, obviously, but this sense of wanting to protect the children, protect them from harm, protect them. So, and again, that's so understandable, particularly in the last year and a half, where we're all doing our best to protect our vulnerable people, children, adults, older people. But protection can backfire too, because it can be a sense of, well, we don't have opportunities to develop resilience. So there's a question here. Take a guidance for it, and I'm taking a specific one, and then we can broaden it out. But a guidance for a 3-year-old child who's the eldest in the family, who's very hard on herself. So this is a perfectionism, Colman. She gets upset if she colors outside the line. She can't do something the first time she tries. She takes winning to an extreme, or she's already showing signs of perfectionism. So I have a few thoughts on that, but what would you think in
Yeah.
response to that?
I think some ways we have gotten into an idea of championing perfectionism as a good thing. I'm a little different on that. I think perfectionism is a fear of getting it wrong, as opposed to a desire to get it right. So it's not necessarily linked to a kind of a narcissism, but also almost a fear and an anxiety. And in that way, I think we have to be allowed or give permission to get it wrong and survive getting it wrong, if that makes sense. So and it's really important that we don't fall into the trap of rewarding external variables, because that's what school and society does. You're the best listener, you're the best drawer, you're the fastest runner, you're this. And we underestimate other value systems around things like your kindness, your generosity, your loyalty, these are things that are not measured. There are no prizes for that. And so from the point of view of trying to shift that value system back to having fun is more important than having the perfect picture. Enjoying a sporting occasion is better than coming out with the medal or winning. And really trying to sell that notion. She's only 3, so she hasn't got a lens that isn't adjustable at this point. It's very adjustable, but it's really important. And maybe that's just her temperament, and her way is to kind of look to try and be competitive and to be the best and to be anxious that she gets it wrong. You have to work with that temperament as opposed to working against it. And so pitching the other gains from experiences other than the outcome. And I would absolutely be someone who would convey that it's important to improve. It's important to congratulate effort, not outcome. You did really well. You did, rather than, because we're a very outcome focused society, and children live in a very outcome focused society, and it's up to the adults in the room to adjust that. So yeah, I think it is about trying to shift her value system, allow her to get it wrong, and allow her to get it wrong and survive, and make sure that everything's fine afterwards. Even if you do draw outside the lines, nothing bad happened, and we're still okay. So.
Yes, I agree with that. And for me, a key thing there is how the parents and the adults around her respond. So a practical thing that they might do is ignore it. And so that she's not getting attention for getting it right, but also for not getting it right. And I think when we're little, we all learn ways of being in the world that makes us feel better. And whether that's perfectionism, or some people act out, or some people help. And it can work really well when we're little, but it backfires as adults. So a little girl, a 3-year-old who's learned that if I don't get it right, I feel bad. If I get it right, I feel good. That can be kind of black and white. So helping her by maybe distracting, or maybe helping her make a mistake. I did some training with Professor Philip Kendall in Temple University years ago, and he's a massive world expert in the area of children with anxiety. But one of the exercises the children who were perfectionists would be asked to do and helped to do was to deliberately make a mistake. And they might make something like, write a letter to him and put a full stop instead of a comma, or a comma instead of a full stop. And these were really, really anxious 10, 12-year-old children, 8, 10-year-olds who were terrified of making a mistake. So they'd be helped make a mistake, spelling mistake, whatever it was. And then Phil would either come down the corridor, see there's a sign for a cake sale, SAIL instead of SALE, and he'd ignore the spelling mistake, or he'd say, oh, that's not how you spell it. And the child could be very upset about this. But then the worst fear happened. Did the world end? No, it didn't. So a big part of helping a child do that is to work with the parents and managing their anxieties around it, because the idea of a child feeling upset because they've made a mistake, they might want to make them absolutely protect them from that, so they never make a mistake, so they don't feel they upset. So it's working with parents as well. And my anxiety is, when I just check, yeah, we have a few more questions coming in. This is an interesting one. They all are, how can you convince yourself that the anxious thoughts are not real, and to stop them from leading to an anxiety or a panic attack?
Yeah, I mean, again, our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors are all linked, and so they're not mutually exclusive. So how you feel about something can influence how you think about it, and what you do about it, and what you do about it can affect how you think about it and how you feel about it. So we have to kind of manage that in that way. I mean, I would be someone who and I'm not so sure, Claire, might be a different view from yourself, but for me, emotion should drive thinking rather than thinking should drive emotion. So the origin should be, I have a feeling and I think about it, and I can work on ways that think about it that makes me feel worse, or think about it in a way that makes me feel a little bit better. But oftentimes where the origin starts with just thinking, and then that thinking starts to make me feel something, it can give extra power to thoughts, that we think the thought has power over ourselves. And one of the things we would oftentimes say in the therapy room is a thought is just a thought, and would use an exercise where there might be a box of tissues on the table, and I would say to the patient, the young person, if you think about moving that box of tissues, how long will it take before it works? And they'll say, well, I can't take, because a thought has no place in real life. It doesn't have any power. And so from the point of view of disabling the power of the thought is really important. And trying to kind of, again, trying to see where that emotion is, and I think in some ways we can overestimate that. I mean, if somebody we love dies, or if we have a breakup of a relationship and somebody says, don't feel sad, you can't just not feel sad. It's how we emotions are quite a bit outside of our control, but how we think about emotion and what we do about emotion can absolutely influence how that feels. So I would be saying to them that we can empower our thoughts to be really helpful, and they can really help us to feel better. But our thoughts can also be the origin of making us feel bad. And let's try and see, where can we start with a feeling and then think about it, rather than, if I'm starting with thinking and that's making me feel something, then I've got the wiring a little bit the wrong way around, and I need to adjust that a little bit. But the thoughts, feelings, behavior area is probably your area, Claire. So I wouldn't mind hearing what you've got to say on this one as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with you in terms of start with the feeling. I've developed a very practical sentence to help people manage. It's kind of taking the whole principles of cognitive behavioral therapy into one sentence, and it starts with feeling. So I feel anxious, I feel apprehensive, I feel upset. B, so A is acknowledge, so it's ABC coping sentence. A, acknowledge. B, because. So I feel apprehensive because I feel, for parents now, I feel worried because I think my child is worrying so much. B, because, so A, and then B, because I think. And I encourage people to put I think, and I agree with you, Colman, it's not always a thought. And I say to people, if I was beside you and I stood on your toe, you'd feel pain, not because you thought I did, but because I did. So a lot of times the first is we feel. but it's their interpretation of that feeling. So how dare he, or why did she do this, or so I feel upset because I think this, but, and then I choose to breathe slowly. And there's a breathing exercise I teach people, which is tightening our non-dominant hand, breathing in, holding our breath 2, 3, breathing out, and linking it with a helpful thought, which is often something like, I choose to breathe slowly, or maybe it's okay, or I choose to take my power back, or I choose to do it anyway. And so it's taking the 3 in. But when we're talking about thoughts, a lot of the thoughts we have, a lot of thoughts I have, really can cause me upset and can trigger me to feel anxious. So it's like a light switch or a smoke alarm that's faulty. It's going on and on and on. So people say, trust your feelings. And this is where I might be different from you in this. I don't believe we can trust our feelings, because our feelings can be dependent on what we think and what we do. But we can trust our instinct, which is different. We can acknowledge our feelings. And if we think of thoughts, if you went into your kitchen, Colman, and there were 4 people, 4 strangers there injecting themselves with not nice drugs, feet up on the table looking for a cup of tea, my sense is you'd want them out. You'd recognize they've no right to be there. You get rid of them. With thoughts, we cannot get rid of them, but we can recognize them as not helpful. So I often just say to people, so imagine you're at a child's birthday party and you've been asked to stand in the garden and only allow the people in who are supposed to be in. So there are 3 people staggering up the path, vomiting, they're drinking vodka, they're drunk. Would you let them in? No. A few people escaped from jail. Would you let them in? No. And then a few of the birthday boy or girl's friends coming up the path. Would you let them in? Of course you would. So with our thoughts, we don't have that luxury, but we can recognize them as helpful or unhelpful. So that's the way that I would manage that one. And then looking at the meaning of the thought. So we all could have the same thought, but we could have very, very different meanings. And then that's linked with what we believe. And in terms of helping develop resilience, a lot of parents, I think, really believe they're not good enough. They have to try harder. They have to, they just have to. And there can be a lot of pressure there. But maybe it's like a child learning to ride a bike. Maybe it's as they fall off and get back on again with the cut knee that they actually learn to develop the resilience rather than protecting them. So I explain CBT, use a triangle, an inverted triangle. So what are we thinking? How are we feeling? What are we doing? That's the first step of 3. The second are 4 questions. Do our feelings make sense? And in my view, they always do, either based on reality or based on what we think and what we do. The second question, are our thoughts helpful or unhelpful? Often unhelpful. The third question is, what do we believe? And really becoming aware of our beliefs and challenging them. So people believe they're not good enough, or they're not going to be able, or the leaving start's going to be too hard, or whatever it is. But we know the world's not flat, and we know the Titanic did sink. So just because people believe whatever they believe doesn't mean it's true. And then the arrow is going on action. And this is where this is where we make the difference. Are our actions helpful or unhelpful? So there's a point where reassuring isn't helpful because the child's not going to believe it. Avoiding is not helpful. Beating ourselves up, watching horror movies of the future and the past, comparing ourselves, all of that. But literally saying, I feel anxious because I think this is so hard, but I choose to do it anyway. Susan Jeffers' book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, but with a sense of understanding and compassion, because I think that's the piece that we're all so hard on ourselves. And 3-year-olds, really hard. I didn't get that right. I have to. So helping them and helping us really develop the compassion around it. So that's my my approach.
I think a practical thing for people at home who have a child who may be anxious like that, one of the sayings that I find helpful is, a feeling is not a fact, right? So from the point of view of, would it hold up in a court of law? So if Claire, if you're sitting in the witness box and you're saying, I think that guy killed that guy, and the judge says, well, why do you think that? And you said, well, because I feel he did. It wouldn't be taken as fact, so a feeling is not a fact. So just because we feel something wrong is going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. And we can't overemphasize the value of feelings. And so again, trying to challenge it and ask yourself, would it stand up in a court of law? And if it's not a fact, then it's a feeling, and feelings are things that need to be challenged.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a note here from Jamie, who's monitoring the questions coming in, and she's asking us to look at this specific question. Sometimes I feel my son, who's 11, is being almost overly resilient, And I struggle to signal to him that it's okay, you can say what you feel and it's not complaining. So that sounds like, a very good child who doesn't want to upset anybody. What's your thoughts on that, Colman?
Yeah, this is something I wrote about recently. The burden of being good, and one of the things that we need children to have is a voice, and that voice needs to be something that allows us to struggle, to have agreeableness is not necessarily a good factor when it comes to mental health. From the point of view of we need to have a kind of an assertiveness within ourselves to kind of say, oh, well, I'm challenging that, or I don't really think that's good. And many parents who are battling with their teenager or whatever it might be, that's at least they're talking to you, and that's at least they're expressing their feelings and their emotions. And there are two types of young people in the world. There's internalizers and externalizers, and the externalizers are the slamming doors and I hate my life and the blue hair and tattoos, and they express their angst with the world in a very visible way. The internalizer will tend to ruminate, keep things to themselves, not want to burden other people. And it's a balance of the two is really that we should strive for. I mean, the internalizer is not always the one that's coping better. They're just more silent about their struggle. But for me, I think we need to give permission to struggle. We need to give license to have disagreement, and we need to really stop rewarding compliance as much as we do. From the point of view of in many ways the squeaky wheel is the only one that we oil, and so sometimes the quiet, independent, functioning child is that way, not because they're okay, but because they cannot use their voice, or they're not able to articulate what it is that they're struggling with, or they don't want to burden people with that. For me, it's about everyone having permission to struggle. And again, to parents out there, we live in an attention economy, and children will vie for attention in ways that they want, and maybe that's through misbehavior, maybe that's through struggle, and we've kind of gotten into this view of equal. Everyone has to be equal. We have to give equal attention. I think we have to move from equal to equitable. If your child has special needs, they may need more appointments and things like that. Doesn't mean that they're more special or that the other person isn't forgotten about, but important to remember the sibling, the non-affected child, and how they're perceiving the way in which the attention economy is being divvied out as such. And children just need to have a sense of we've got this. When you need it, you will have it. And it's not about measuring who gets the same, but it's knowing that when I need it, it will be there for me. And I think as a kind of a message for parents, it is about trying to contain that as much as we can, but giving license for disagreement. And for parents out there who have a very vocal teen who is kind of disgruntled and openly doing that, maybe that's a blessing. Maybe that's a good thing. And be thankful for that, because a lot of young people who end up sitting in front of me are the quiet ones who never said anything, who never had any sort of a disagreement or used their voice, and that led them to struggle in ways that were less visible along the way. And parents will always say, I've never had to raise my voice to her whole life. I can't see where this is coming from. Not having to raise your voice to your child their whole life is not necessarily healthy. They need to have that ability to be difficult. And your child, make sure your child is not being bad because they're afraid that it will lead to them being rejected. Do you know what I mean? They can have meltdowns, they can have those issues, and they will be loved anyway.
Absolutely. I use the image of a volcano, that when we're very little, we can learn to bottle up, and we can be rewarded for it's great to feel happy, excited, sad, all of that. But if we're feeling unhappy or sad or lonely or different, we think there's something wrong with that. And those emotions can be labeled as negative. I've never done that. I think if a feeling makes sense, it's okay. So I think it's really important for children and adults and teenagers of any age to know that it's okay to feel however we feel. It's what we do about it. So I think my experience of parents is that they can get very concerned and upset if their child isn't feeling happy, because they can feel happy if their child's feeling happy. So there's a huge pressure to have everybody feeling really good. So the child who isn't can bottle that up and maybe not even realize that they're not. And we're anxiety, but I find anger can be really bottled up. And one of the ways when I'm working with parents and I say how you'll know this is of help is your child might start to get really cross and really angry in a way that he or she hasn't been. So I absolutely agree with you. Colman, I've been looking at the questions and the comments, and oh my goodness, there's representing what you've been saying in terms of really serious concerns that parents are having now. One person that the child always looks at the negative or the worst or the hardest end of things, concerns about going into secondary school, but there's concerns about being bullied in the past and worried about what would happen in the future. But there's one particular one, if I can address it specifically, about a young child, a 5-year-old, who, and tragically, his young uncle in his 20s took his own life a few months ago. And the mum is saying that he's become very upset about what's happening, and doing things like checking doors or washing his hands or whatever. And my sense in that is it's really important for parents to know that they don't have to be super parents. And if they're concerned about something, get help, take help, use help. So talk to their GP. So this conversation here, we're not going to be able to address any of the questions in detail that are being sent in. But that just struck me in terms of a real one for the parents to look at the impact of their loss on themselves, and then really helping the child. So ABC, so acknowledge, yeah, I feel upset or I feel sad because this has been hard, but what can we do about it? So playing and maybe play therapy would be really good for that child. And if I can link with just bringing that to the other end, because in terms of developing resilience, a huge fear that I've noticed parents having that's been increased over the last few years is how to respond to a child who is talking about the wish they were dead, or they're engaging in self-harm, or they might say, they might be asked, and I can't even use the words because I don't use them, but around the area of death, they might be asked, do you feel suicidal? In my view, there's no such thing as feeling suicidal. There are thoughts, and people can have those thoughts. It can feel worried, upset, shocked, frightened, or relieved. But the key thing is, well, what are they going to do? And helping children know that it's normal to have thoughts around, oh, I've had enough, but helping parents manage their anxieties and then getting the balance right, that there are occasions where children and young people are seriously struggling. So that's a big long thing over to you. But how would you advise parents between knowing when's the time to act and get help, and when is it okay to say, look, that's normal adolescent behavior? There's lectures I've
Yeah.
given on this. I'm sure there's lectures you've given on this. So it's a hard one to throw at you for a few minutes.
It's really challenging, and it's the most common question you get asked is, at what point do I need to say this is beyond me? In terms of how much is enough. And again, it comes back to the issue here is that mental health problems are an invisible illness. So from the point of view of, and what makes this work so interesting but also so difficult, is that we don't have a definitive conclusion. So we don't have an X-ray for depression. We don't have a blood test for anxiety. We don't have a MRI that says you have your anxiety level is 6 out of 10. Like, we can take bloods and all those sorts of things. So we very much are in guessing work, from the point of view of, it's the science of subjectivity. So you're trying to understand how it's making the other person feel. So there is that first bit where we talked about in the last grade, where everyone needs to be happy. And if we're not happy, there's a problem, right? That's not necessarily true. The way it is that we have mental health on one side, we have mental health problems and distress, and then we have mental disorder and illness on the right-hand side. All of us will experience some degree of mental stress throughout our lives, whether that's a relationship breakup, a job loss, or any sort of life thing will throw up. It's usually a transient thing that, with the support of our family and friends, we can find a way back to kind of functioning and managing things fairly well. And we don't want to over pathologize behaviors that are, not all worry is anxiety, not all sadness is depression, and allowing the kind of the flow of emotion. Oftentimes it is, and it's not necessarily about the acuity of the feeling, it's the length of time that it stays around. So from the point of view of something like grief, and this child whose kind of whole concept of permanency has been altered by that, and children place a huge value on permanency right from the very off. So you go back to the peekaboo, they're gone. That's the child getting used to absence and return. You see huge amounts of children having anxieties around death, and will I go sleep, will I wake up the next morning, and are you going anywhere, and attachment, and all of those worries about loss. And that's very interesting in terms of the fairy tales. Cinderella, Snow White, what's in common with all the fairy tales is they have no parents. So basically, it's reassuring the child that even if you suffer the most monumental loss, you will survive. And so that's why children enjoy listening to fairy tales for that purpose. So how do we say this is too much or this is enough? I need to get help. I don't need to get help, without those definitives. And it is really about how it impacts on the child's functioning, right? And how long it's going on for. And have you put in as many supports as you can within an informal context? So parents, friends, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Then we may need to look towards getting a next layer of help, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that the child is kind of given a diagnosis and there's a kind of they become a veteran patient of the mental health services the rest of their lives. It's about how do we return them from this position of mental distress to functioning, to mental health, or to be able to manage that. And sometimes that's just therapy, that's play therapy, that could be art therapy, that could be CBT, that could be group therapy, it could be social skills work. And, our life will throw things up at us that will cause us to have a wobble, and we might have sleeplessness, we might go off our food, we might, struggle with anxiety, going out, social things. But generally, things when things return to some degree of normal, we can find our way out of that. And again, we make these decisions around, well, probably pre-COVID, around colds and flus, and this cough isn't going away, and I've had it for 3 weeks, and I'm going to get it checked out now. From a mental health perspective, it's a bit like that as well. We have to kind of give it a time to kind of adjust, and then maybe decide at this point, okay, this is going on too long, or this is becoming more of a problem, and seek the lowest level of help first. Now, what I would say, and I think it would be disingenuous for us not to say, the mental health services are overwhelmed, understaffed, and the waiting lists, and it's all very well for all of us to go and say, talk to people. But when there's no one to talk to for a year and a half because you're on a waiting list, that is an issue. And I'm never in a position to come on anything like this and defend the mental health services, because they are not what they need to be. And I would understand every bit of disgruntlement of people who might be on this call saying, yeah, but, and I agree with you, it is absolutely not good enough. And we need a primary care service for mental health. We need to be able to catch these children early. We need to be able to intervene and not let them get to the levels where, early intervention is key when it comes to mental health distress in children, and we know that all the research points to that. But we unfortunately haven't got the services that represent that. And so unfortunately things may get worse. But I oftentimes think, we need to be real world. So what I would say is everything that you can do in your power, whether it's bringing in cousins or aunts or friends or uncles, someone who might be able to talk to this person, help them through it, put all the supports in place, and see if that works. See if things get better. If it's not get better, go to the next level. But it is it's important not to pathologize everything, because some sadness is okay, and it's important not to ignore anything. Because, and just I finish on this piece, the issue around suicidal self-harm claims and all that sort of stuff, of course, that's a very startling thing for any parent to hear. But teenagers and children use extreme language to communicate what they feel. So they'll say to their friends, I hate you and I'll never speak to you again. And then half an hour later, they're out in the green hugging. So the issue is that, the world of the child is extreme. It is very 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 10. They don't tend to do 4 to 7. Do you know what I mean? And so it's not to dismiss it, but it is to understand the context of the child who's saying things that sound quite stark and would stop you in your tracks. But it's about probably understanding a little bit around the context of that and trying to understand it as best you can.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time, so I'll just give a quick response to that as well, and then we'll wrap up, Colman. I think it's really important for parents to be as relaxed as they can and to trust their instinct. So if their instinct is, you know what, there's something seriously wrong here, that they act on it. And if their instinct is, I think it's maybe just looking for attention. And we know in the area of self-harm that there are warning signs. So one of the key one is if somebody withdraws, that's not okay. So red flags for me is somebody who's avoiding things, checking things, looking for reassurance, and parents can feed into the giving reassurance. So I suggest that parents change their patterns so they go vague. So instead of, yes, I'll collect you at 4 o'clock tomorrow, you know what, I'm not actually sure, but I'll collect you before bedtime. And that can be really difficult for a child who wants the reassurance. And this is where parents will go, well, wait a minute, we don't want our child to feel bad. So the more parents understand the whole area of anxiety, the whole area of depression, the whole area of resilience, and that it's facing things it can build. Another way then is to really head on the area of death. So a child who's frightened, the mother has died, what if the father is going to die? And people are tiptoeing. I'd say, well, let's suppose you knew this time next week your dad was going to die at 4 o'clock. What would you do? And, they might say they cry but really, what would they do? What would any of us do? We'd make that time count. And when is the time to worry about it? It's if or when it happens. So allowing people to say, yeah, look, if the worst thing happens, I remember asking a child that, what would happen if your mother died? And she was worried about her mother going out and having an accident. So what was so bad about that? What's so bad about that? What's so bad about that? Bottom line, she might die. What's so bad about that? And her parents looked at me in shock, what? And the child said to me, this is years ago, oh, well, Auntie Joan would mind me, and that's not so bad. So if we can look at what our worst fear is, and with COVID, we've had a pandemic and we have survived. And tragically, some people have died. But for whatever reason, we know we're all going to die. So we have to make sense of this in some way. And there's a difference between teaching moments and nurturing moments. So teaching, so the children now are learning that things can happen that we've no control over. But they're also learning we're resilient. We keep going, we adapt, we survive. We have too much toilet paper, so the next pandemic, we won't buy as much of that. We'll get maybe more rice or whatever it is. So we're really strong and reminding ourselves of that. So acknowledging it, but I choose to do the best I can. Colman, it's been a huge pleasure to have you here. I want you to have the last word. So is there one takeaway, and then I'll introduce next month's webinar.
Yeah, just to say this, I do have a free podcast asking for a parent. If somebody has a question that you want asked, if you email askingforaparent@gmail.com, I'll answer it in the listeners' questions episode the following fortnight. So I can get to questions. If we didn't get to them today, email them to that and I'll get to them. It's a free resource. There's 30 hours of stuff there that people
want. Oh, that's fantastic. And that's a great introduction to the Aware website, just to encourage people to really use that. There's a library of lectures going back for years. There's a previous webinars, and there's also the Aware services. There's a support group. There's the support line. There's CBT programs that are free to do. And I regularly encourage parents to do them. The life skills programs, they're upskilling their own skills. And as I said, the more relaxed parents are, the better. And just to flag, and Colman, this is a conversation that we could have just literally kept going for the rest of the day. I have really enjoyed working with you, and I love we're coming at the same thing from two different angles, but there's nothing you said that I don't agree with. I mean, I might have said something you don't agree with, but it's great. So next month's webinar is on supporting the supporter. And we've Breed O'Mara, who was previous Director of Services with Aware, Psychotherapist, and we'll also have people with lived experience of depression and supporting someone who has depression. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's the 8th of September, 2021. This webinar, as all of them, are being recorded, so they're on the website. And I'm conscious I'm rushing, but I want to get everything in. And Colman, gur mille maith, and thank you to Jamie and to Karen, the back staff, in setting up the webinars as well.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.